The summer sun hung lazily over the small town, spilling golden light through half-open curtains. In a quiet house on the edge of town, 12-year-old Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his hands nervously fidgeting with a pencil. His heart thumped louder than the clock on the wall. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know when. Earlier that afternoon, Daniel had done something he wasn't proud of. It wasn't the first time he had slipped, but it was the first time he had been caught. His father, a tall man with stern eyes and a voice that commanded silence, had found out that Daniel had lied about finishing his homework. Instead of practicing his math, Daniel had been outside, playing baseball with his friends. A harmless lie, perhaps, in the mind of a boy. But to his father, a lie was no small thing. In his house, truth was sacred, and honesty was non-negotiable. Daniel, his father's voice had echoed in the hallway just hours earlier. We'll talk about this tonight. Those words had haunted Daniel all evening. He knew what talk meant. In his father's language, it meant more than words. It meant punishment. Now, as the dinner plates were cleared away and silence settled over the house, Daniel felt the air grow heavy. His younger sister tiptoed past him, her wide eyes full of pity. His mother said nothing, only sighing quietly as she washed the dishes. The weight of discipline belonged to the father, and no one interfered. When the kitchen finally emptied, Daniel sat alone. He tried to imagine a way out. Maybe if he apologized hard enough, his father would forgive him. Maybe if he promised never to lie again, he'd be spared. But deep down, he knew his father too well. Words alone would never be enough. The creak of footsteps on the wooden floor snapped him back to reality. His father entered the room, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. His broad shoulders cast a shadow across the boy. "Stand up," his father said, his voice calm but unyielding. Daniel's legs trembled as he obeyed. "Do you know why you're here?" his father asked, staring directly into his son's eyes. Daniel hesitated. His throat was dry. Because I lied," he whispered. The father nodded once. "And what does lying do, Daniel?" his father asked. It breaks trust," Daniel replied, his voice shaking. "Exactly." His father's tone was sharp. "When you lie, you destroy the very thing that holds this family together. Trust is not something you play with. Do you understand?" Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. His father sighed, rubbing a hand across his forehead. "I don't punish you because I enjoy it. I punish you because I have to. The world will not forgive lies. If you don't learn that now, life will teach you in ways far harsher than I ever could." Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted to cry out, to say he already understood, but it was too late. His father's eyes flicked toward the wooden chair by the wall. Daniel knew what that meant. His heart sank. "Bend over," his father commanded. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. His legs felt heavy as stone as he walked toward the chair. He placed his hands on the seat, lowering his head in shame. He felt smaller than ever, like a child trapped in a moment too big for him. Behind him, he heard the creak of footsteps on the wooden floor. The sound alone made his skin crawl. "This will hurt," his father said, "but it will remind you of what honesty means." The first strike landed with a sharp crack. Daniel gasped, his body jerking from the sting. The second came quickly, and then a third. Each strike burned against his skin, but deeper still, each one carved itself into his memory. Daniel cried out, not just from pain, but from shame, regret, and fear. His tears fell freely onto the chair. He hated the sound of his own sobs, but he couldn't stop them. Through the punishment, his father remained silent, his face set like stone. He did not curse, he did not shout. He simply delivered the punishment with a chilling sense of purpose. After several strikes, his father finally stopped. The belt dangled loosely at his side. Daniel remained bent over the chair, his chest heaving, his cheeks wet with tears. There was silence, so heavy it pressed against Daniel's ears. Finally, his father spoke. "Stand up." Daniel rose slowly, avoiding his father's gaze. His legs trembled beneath him. The man placed the belt on the table and looked at his son with steady eyes. "You will remember this," he said quietly. "You will remember that a lie has a cost. Do not make me remind you again." Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "Go to your room," his father added. Daniel turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. His body ached, but more than that, his heart carried the weight of his father's disappointment. As he climbed the stairs, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This night would stay with him forever. Daniel shut his bedroom door quietly, leaning against it as though it were the only thing holding him up. His body ached where the belt had struck him, but the sharpest pain wasn't on his skin, it was inside his chest. He could still hear the echo of the leather cutting through the air, still feel the weight of his father's eyes pressing into him. Collapsing onto his bed, Daniel buried his face into the pillow, muffling his sobs. His small shoulders shook with every breath. He wanted the tears to stop, but they refused. They flowed as if his heart itself were weeping. "I'm not bad," he whispered into the fabric. "I'm not bad." But the guilt gnawed at him. He had lied, and worse, he had been caught. It wasn't just about skipping math homework. It was about trust, as his father said. Daniel realized that when his father's stern voice had spoken about broken trust, it had cut deeper than the belt ever could. As the minutes passed, his sobs softened into quiet sniffles. He turned onto his back, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling like a storm. Part of him hated his father in that moment. Hated him for being so harsh, for making his skin sting, for making him feel so small. But another part, the part Daniel couldn't quite silence, felt something else. Respect. Fear. Even in a strange way, love. It was confusing. How could he hate and love the same person at once? He remembered his father's words. "The world will not forgive lies. If you don't learn that, life will teach you in ways far harsher than I ever could." Those words circled his mind, repeating like a song he couldn't escape. Daniel wondered if that was true. Would life really punish him worse than his father had? He thought about his teacher at school, about the principal's sharp eyes, about stories he'd heard of kids who got into serious trouble for cheating or stealing. Maybe his father was right. Maybe this was better than what the world might do later. But even so, the sting on his skin reminded him of how cruel lessons could feel. Hours slipped by. The house grew quiet as his sister went to bed, and his mother's footsteps faded into silence. Daniel lay awake in the dark, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wooden chair, the belt, the stern look on his father's face. He wondered if he would ever forget. The next morning, Daniel moved gingerly, wincing at every stretch and step. His mother noticed the puffiness in his eyes, but said nothing. She simply placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, her silence speaking more than words. His father sat across the table, sipping his coffee, reading the paper. Not once did his father look up. Daniel wanted to say something. He wanted to apologize again, to promise that he would never lie again, but his throat locked up, and the words never came. Instead, he ate quietly, feeling the tension wrap around the breakfast table like invisible chains. After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his school bag and slipped out the door. The air outside was cool, and the breeze on his face brought a strange kind of relief. But as he walked to school, he noticed something. His steps were different, more careful, more deliberate. He found himself looking both ways at the street crossings, something he often forgot to do. He greeted the neighbor politely instead of rushing past as he usually did. It was as if the punishment had made him suddenly aware of everything around him. At school, Daniel sat quietly in class, his mind unusually focused. When his teacher handed out math worksheets, Daniel worked diligently. His pencil scratched across the paper. For the first time, he wanted to get every answer right,
not just to avoid trouble, but because he didn't want to feel the shame of lying again. The memory of the belt hovered in the back of his mind like a shadow, pushing him to stay straight, to avoid slipping into laziness or dishonesty. And though the stain had faded, the lesson lingered. Still, a part of him wrestled with doubt. Was this really the best way to learn? Did fear make him better or just quieter? That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Daniel's father finally looked at him. His stern gaze softened, just a slightly. "How was school?" he asked. Daniel glanced up, startled. It was fine." "Homework done?" "Yes, sir." The father gave a small nod, then returned to his meal. For Daniel, that tiny nod meant more than words.
Years slipped by, like pages turning in a book. Daniel grew taller, his voice deepened, and the once small boy who had trembled before his father's belt was now a young man preparing to leave high school. Yet no matter how much he changed on the outside, the memory of that night in the kitchen never faded. It lived in him, like a scar, not visible, but felt. At 17, Daniel often found himself replaying that moment. The sting of the belt had long vanished, but the weight of the lesson remained. Sometimes he felt grateful for it. He had become one of the most disciplined students in his school. Teachers praised his honesty, his hard work, his reliability. He never cheated on tests, never skipped homework again. Friends knew him as the one who kept his word, the one who could be trusted. But at other times, Daniel wrestled with a lingering ache. He remembered the tears, the shame, the way his father's silence had cut deeper than words. Did it really have to be that way? Did fear have to be the price of becoming responsible? One autumn evening, Daniel sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His father joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. The older man's hair had begun to gray, and his shoulders, once so broad and intimidating, now carried the weight of years. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the cool air wrapping around them. Finally, his father spoke. "You've grown into a fine young man," he said quietly. Daniel turned surprised. Praise from his father was rare, and it felt like a rare jewel when it came. "Thank you, sir," Daniel said softly. His father sipped his tea, then set the mug down. "Do you remember the night I punished you for lying about your homework?" Daniel's breath caught. Of all the memories, that was the one he could never forget. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember." The father's eyes lingered on the horizon. "I've often thought about that night. I know it was hard for you. It wasn't easy for me either." Daniel blinked. He had never imagined his father carrying doubts. It wasn't? His father shook his head. "Punishing you was one of the hardest things I ever did. But I did it because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let lies take root in you, they would grow into something worse. I wanted to stop that before it started." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Hearing his father admit fear, admit struggle, it was something new, something humanizing. "I thought you hated me that night," Daniel confessed. The father turned to look at him, his eyes softer than Daniel had ever seen. "I didn't want you to hate me. I wanted you to understand, but I knew you couldn't then. Not even now. But maybe one day. I hoped you'd see it for what it was. Not cruelty, but love in its hardest form." The words struck Daniel deeply. He had always suspected there was love buried beneath his father's sternness, but to hear it said aloud changed something inside him. "I did hate you. For a while. I hated the pain, the shame. But over time, I think I began to see what you meant. It made me want to be better, to be honest, to never feel that way again." His father nodded slowly. "Then the lesson did its work. Still, if I could go back, Maybe I'd try to teach it differently. You deserved discipline, yes, but perhaps also a gentler hand. Life doesn't always give us second chances, Daniel, but you will. You'll be a father someday, and you'll have to choose how you'll teach your own children. Those words sank into Daniel like seeds in fertile soil. He realized then that the punishment was not just a moment in his past, but a crossroads for his future. He could carry forward his father's methods, or he could forge a new path. The years rolled on, and Daniel eventually became a father himself. Holding his newborn son in his arms, he felt the full weight of his father's words. Parenting was not just about rules. It was about shaping lives, about carrying love in every decision, even the hard ones. As his son grew, Daniel remembered the night of his own punishment. There were times when the boy disobeyed, times when Daniel felt the familiar fire of frustration rising. The memory of the belt whispered in his mind. He could almost hear the crack, feel the echo of authority. But then he would see his son's wide, innocent eyes, and he would hear his father's voice again. Maybe I'd try to teach it differently. And so Daniel chose differently. He still believed in discipline, but he chose conversation over the belt, guidance over fear. He spoke to his son about choices and consequences, about honesty and trust. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But every time, Daniel reminded himself, love can be firm without being harsh. Still, he never forgot the night that changed him. In fact, it became the anchor of his parenting journey, a story he carried like a torch, one that guided him to balance strength with compassion. Looking back as an adult, Daniel realized something profound. The spanking punishment had indeed changed his life forever. It had planted two seeds inside him, one of discipline, the other of reflection. Without the first, he might have grown careless, irresponsible, or dishonest. Without the second, he might have repeated the same harshness without question. Together, they shaped him into a man who could carry lessons from the past while also building a gentler future. The punishment had hurt, yes. It had left tears and pain, but it had also forced him to grow, to think, to become more than the mistake he had made. And perhaps that was what his father had intended all along. One evening, years later, Daniel stood in his own kitchen, watching his son at the table, pencil in hand, struggling with homework. For a moment, Daniel saw his younger self reflected in the boy, restless, tempted to push the book aside, tempted to take the easy road. Daniel placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "It's hard now, but doing it right will make you stronger later." His son looked up at him, eyes filled with trust, and in that moment, Daniel realized something. He had broken the cycle. The lesson of the belt had transformed into something new. It was no longer about fear. It was about guidance, patience, and a different kind of love. Daniel smiled faintly. Yes, the punishment had changed his life forever, not because of the pain it caused, but because of the man it helped him to choose to become. And as the night grew quiet, Daniel knew that the story of that spanking would live on, not as a wound, but as a reminder that even the hardest lessons can bloom into something greater if we choose to let them. So, what do you think? Was the father's strict punishment an act of love or an act of cruelty? Did the spanking really save Daniel from a darker path, or could the lesson have been taught in a gentler way? His story shows us how one moment of discipline can echo for a lifetime, shaping not just a child, but generations to come. Now the question is, if you were in Daniel's place, or in his father's shoes, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more powerful, real-life inspired stories.